They thought refusing the gambit made them safe, but in the shadows of defense lies a deadly trap. Welcome to Top King's Gambit Decline Traps for Black, where solid defenses morph into vicious counterattacks. In this video, you'll uncover lethal tactics, surprising maneuvers, and opening traps that punish White's early aggression with pawn to f4. Let's flip the script, turning defense into domination, and catching White completely off guard. Our first trap is simple yet devastating. White begins with pawn to e4. We reply in kind with pawn to e5. White launches the King's Gambit with pawn to f4. We decline the offer and play bishop to c5. Now, many unsuspecting players grab the bait with pawn captures pawn on e5, a critical mistake. We respond with queen to h4, delivering a check. If White moves the king to e2, we swoop in with queen captures pawn on e4, delivering checkmate in just 4 moves. If White tries to block with pawn to g3, we still strike. Queen takes pawn on e4, checking the king and forking the rook on h1. On the next move, we snatch the rook, securing a winning position in just 5 moves. Next, let's dive into a classic weapon, the Falkbeer Countergambit. White begins with pawn to e4, and we reply with pawn to e5. After White plays pawn to f4, we counter with pawn to d5, the Falkbeer. If White captures on d5, most players expect us to recapture or push forward. Instead, we play a sneaky move, pawn to c6. White often responds with queen to e2, targeting our central pawn. We then play pawn captures on d5. Now White gets greedy, queen captures on e5. We calmly play bishop to e7. This tempts White to grab another pawn with queen takes on g7. But they've walked into our trap. We respond with bishop to f6. The queen retreats to her only safe square, g3. And then the finishing blow, bishop to h4. On the next move, we capture White's queen and take control of the game. Now let's explore a trap in the main line of the Falkbeer Countergambit. We start the usual way, pawn to e4, pawn to e5. White plays pawn to f4, and we counter with pawn to d5. White captures with pawn to d5, and we strike with pawn to e4, locking down the center and disrupting White's development. This pawn now blocks White's knight from reaching its natural square on f3. So White tries to challenge with pawn to d3. We support with knight to f6. White captures, pawn takes on e4, and we recapture with knight takes on e4. White plays knight to c3, and now we deliver queen to h4, checking the king. White blocks with pawn to g3. We respond with knight captures on g3. If White captures the knight with the h-pawn, we'll seize the rook on h1 next move. To avoid this, White plays knight to f3, attacking our queen. We calmly retreat to queen e7, delivering a check. When the king moves to f2, we capture the h1 rook with the knight, giving us a huge material lead and a nearly unstoppable position. Now, what if White plays knight to c3 instead of pawn to d3 in the same line? Again, e4, e5, f4, d5, e takes d5, and we reply with pawn to e4. White plays knight to c3, defending d5 and attacking our central pawn. We develop knight to f6. White adds pressure with queen to e2. We hold strong with bishop to f5. White plays knight captures pawn on e4, and we trade knights. Then comes pawn to d3, attacking our pinned knight. Just when White thinks they've outplayed us, we unleash queen to h4, checking the king. White blocks with pawn to g3. We play queen to e7. After pawn takes our knight on e4, we recapture with bishop takes on e4. Soon, we'll win the rook on h1. Let's say White plays knight to f3. We answer with bishop takes knight. Queen recaptures, we give check with queen, bishop blocks, and we reposition to bishop c5. On the next move, we snatch the rook, gaining a decisive advantage straight from the opening. Now comes a practical and devastating trap, backed by games in real databases. The opening begins as usual, e4, e5, f4, d5. Many aggressive opponents rush to capture our e5 pawn, but it's a critical blunder that loses the game on the spot. How do we punish it? Queen to h4, check. White blocks with pawn to g3. Now queen captures pawn on e4, another check. White plays king to f2. Here, queen takes rook on h1 is good, but we remember Lasker's golden rule. When you see a good move, look for a better one. We play the mind-blowing bishop to c5. Check. White's only legal response is pawn to d4. We capture, bishop takes on d4, check again. White now has no choice but to sacrifice the queen to avoid checkmate. Victory is just a few moves away. Let's now explore how to outwit white if they decline our counter gambit with knight to f3. After e4, e5, f4, d5. White develops knight to f3, guarding against queen to h4. We develop bishop to c5. White continues with knight to c3. We play knight to f6. White grabs the pawn on e5 with their knight. We respond with pawn takes. White plays queen to e2, preparing a sneaky combination. Knight takes on f7, king takes, and queen to c4 check. We calmly develop with knight to c6. White plays knight takes f7, expecting an easy tactic. But instead of capturing the knight, we surprise them with queen to e7. White captures our rook with knight takes 8. We strike back with knight to d4, attacking the queen and threatening a deadly fork with knight takes on c2. White panics and plays queen to d1. Then comes knight to f3, checking the king. After pawn takes the knight, we play pawn to f3, check again. White blocks with bishop to e2. Instead of capturing, we play pawn to f2, yet another check. With king to f1 as the only legal move, we finish with bishop to h3, delivering a brilliant checkmate. And finally, here's a brutal trap to destroy white in just 11 moves. The sequence: e4, e5, f4, d5, e takes d5, e4, knight to c3, knight to f6, pawn to d3. We now pin the knight with bishop to b4. White responds with bishop to d2. We castle. White captures in the center. Pawn takes on e4. We play the subtle but deadly rook to e8. White plays bishop to d3, defending the central pawn. We exchange with bishop takes knight on c3. After bishop recaptures, we play knight takes pawn on e4. White responds with bishop captures knight. Then we hit back with rook takes on e4. Check. White blocks with knight to e2, a fatal mistake. How do we punish it? If you're thinking queen to h4, think again. White survives with pawn to g3. Instead, we strike with bishop to g4. Next move, we'll take the knight and have a completely winning position straight out of the opening. You've just unlocked the deadliest traps for black in the King's Gambit Declined, and how to punish the early f4 with surgical precision. Ready to load your arsenal with more killer lines? Smash that like button if you love winning with traps. Subscribe for weekly tactical guides, opening tricks, and elite level ambushes. Got a favorite response to the King's Gambit Declined? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear your weapon of choice. Until next time. Play sharp, think deep, and never let the attacker walk free.